Hello everyone, viewers. We think we know the story of the Great Plagues. We're told it's a simple, clinical tale of science, a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas, on the backs of rats, a microscopic villain that brought empires to their knees. It's a neat story, a tidy one. It puts the blame on nature, on a mindless organism just trying to survive. But what if that's the greatest lie? What if the official history is a carefully constructed quarantine zone designed to keep us from looking at the real source of the horror? The truth is, the bacterium was just the weapon. The real monster, the one that turned cities into tombs and neighbors into executioners, was something else entirely. Something that lived inside the victims long before the first fever hit. Today, we journey into the heart of It was us. The story begins not with a cough, but with a dream, the dream of a restored Rome. In the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian I sat on the throne of Constantinople, the new Rome, the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire. He was a man of colossal ambition, a restless builder, a codifier of laws, a conqueror. His armies, led by the brilliant General Belisarius, were reclaiming the lost lands of the West North Africa, Italy, parts of Spain. The Mediterranean was once again becoming a Roman lake. It seemed as if the golden eagle of the legions would fly over the 7 hills of Rome once more. The city of Constantinople itself was a jewel, a testament to a millennium of civilization. Its markets overflowed with its libraries held the collected wisdom of Greece and Rome. And at its heart, the Hagia Sophia was rising. A dome so vast it seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain. Humanity seemed to be on the cusp of a new golden age, with reason, law, and faith as its guide. But while Justinian looked west, to the glories of the past, something else was stirring in the east. It began as whispers, travelers' tales from the dusty port of Pelusium in Egypt. A strange sickness, a fever that burned like fire, followed by grotesque swellings in the groin and armpits, the buboes, then came the delirium, the blackening of the skin, and finally, death, swift, merciless, and absolute. It was a phantom that moved without an army. It boarded grain ships bound for the capital, silent and invisible among the sacks of wheat that fed the empire. In the year 541, it arrived in Constantinople. The dream of a restored Rome was about to become a nightmare from which the world would not wake for 1,000 years. At first, it was a curiosity, a disease of the poor in the squalid districts by the docks. The aristocracy, but this enemy did not respect wealth or status. It crept through the city gates, past the imperial guards, and into the very heart of the great palace. The official historian Procopius, a man of logic and reason, tried to document the plague's arrival. But his words betray a creeping dread, a sense that he was not chronicling a disease, but an invasion by a supernatural force. He wrote of phantoms, headless demons that would appear to people in their homes, call them by name, and mark them for death. He spoke of ghost ships sailing into the harbor, manned by headless crews, vessels of pure pestilence. Was this mass hysteria, the fevered imaginings of a terrified populace? Or did Procopius, a man of the court, see something that history has chosen? He described the victims' final hours with chilling clarity. They were racked with delusions, seeing specters and demons. Some would throw themselves from rooftops or into the sea, desperate to escape the torment in their own minds. The city's infrastructure crumbled, the market stalls stood empty, the bakeries went cold. There was no one to bring in the grain, no one to bake the bread. The living were too busy burying the cemeteries overflowed. Trenches were dug, but they were filled as quickly as they were excavated. Justinian ordered the roofs to be stripped from the towers of Sicily across the Golden Horn, and the bodies were simply thrown in, layered with soil like a grotesque lasagna of the dead. 10,000 people a day were dying in Constantinople alone. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, a sweet, sickly perfume. Procopius wrote, "The whole world seemed to be sinking into a bottomless abyss." And then the plague came for the emperor himself. Justinian fell ill. The buboes appeared, the fever raged for a time. The empire held its breath, The man who saw himself as God's regent on earth was now wrestling with a demon he could not comprehend. And in the shadows of the palace, Procopius wrote his Finsiscrit. In this forbidden text, he claimed that Justinian was no man at all, but a demon in human form. He wrote that the emperor's head would sometimes detach from his body and float around the room, that he never slept, and that he was the architect of the plague, a blood sacrifice to sate his demonic nature. Hyperbole. The slander of a disgruntled courtier, or was it the only way a rational man could explain the irrational Justinian survived? He emerged from his sick a changed man, scarred and hardened, but his dream was dead. The empire was bankrupt, its armies decimated, its people scattered and broken. The plague of Justinian killed as many as 50 million people, perhaps half the world's population at the time. It was the final nail in the coffin of the classical world. It shattered the trade routes, emptied the grand Roman roads fell into disrepair. The libraries were lost to fire and neglect. The light of reason flickered and died. But the most terrifying legacy of the Justinian plague wasn't the death toll. It was the memory. A seed of apocalyptic fear was planted deep in the European psyche. They had faced an enemy they could not fight, an anger they could not comprehend. And this belief, this corrosive, terrifying idea, would lie dormant for 800 years, waiting for the rats to board the ships once more, waiting to bloom into a new and even more terrible form of madness. The world forgot. 800 years is a long time. Empires rose and fell. New languages were born. The great Gothic cathedrals clawed their way toward heaven. Trade routes. The arteries of commerce crisscrossed the continent, carrying not just goods, but ideas, pilgrims and soldiers. It was a world that believed it had tamed the chaos of the Dark Ages. It had forgotten the phantom ships of Justinian. It had forgotten the terror that came from the east. In 1347, the memory returned. It came aboard 12 Genoese trading galleys. They limped into the harbour of Messina, Sicily, with a horrific cargo. Most of the sailors were already dead, and those who were still alive were gravely ill, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, horrified, ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbour. But it was too late. The plague had disembarked. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. This was not the same world that had faced Justinian's plague. This was a world of burgeoning cities, packed tight with humanity. Paris, London, Florence. These were tinderboxes of wood, thatch and people, perfect breeding grounds for disease. But more than that, it was a world steeped in a fervent, apocalyptic Christianity. A world that saw the hand of God in every storm, every famine. When the plague struck, they did not see a bacterium. They saw the fulfillment of prophecy. They saw the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse riding across the land, and their reaction was not one of scientific inquiry, but of profound existential terror. The chronicles of the time speak of a death that was almost instantaneous. One writer, Agnolo di Tura of Siena, wrote, "The victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise." The sheer speed of it was incomprehensible. It didn't just kill individuals, it annihilated families. A household could be healthy at sunrise and a tomb by sunset. The social fabric, the very bonds of human. Boccaccio, in his Fay Decameron Fay, described the scene in Florence. Brother was forsaken by brother-nephew, by uncle, sister, by brother, and oftentimes husband by wife, nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate. This was the first great horror, the abandonment of love. The plague didn't just rot the body, it corroded the soul. Doctors, the supposed healers, were powerless. Their treatments were a bizarre mix of folklore and guesswork. They prescribed smelling flowers or herbs, bathing in vinegar and rosewater, or lancing the buboes, which only spread the infection. Some advocated for a life of quiet moderation. Others, Boccaccio describes bands of young men and women who roamed the city. Going from tavern to tavern, drinking without limit or measure, indulging in every carnal pleasure they could find, believing that laughter and song were the best medicine. They were laughing in the face of the apocalypse, and then came the flagellants. This was something new, a phenomenon born of pure, distilled fear. Processions of men, stripped to the waist, would march from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. They moved in a cloud of religious fervor, singing grim hymns and chanting prayers, their backs a bloody pulp. They believed that by punishing their own flesh they could atone for the sins of mankind and persuade God to lift the plague. For a time they were seen as people would flock to see them, dipping cloths in their blood to use as sacred relics, but their piety quickly curdled into something much darker. They were a movement without a leader, a firestorm of fanaticism. They began to preach that the church itself was corrupt, that the clergy had failed in their duty. They started to challenge authority, to whip up the resentments of the poor against the rich, and they needed a scapegoat. Europe's Jewish communities, the old poisonous lie that Jews were the enemies of Christ, resurfaced with a vengeance. Rumors spread like wildfire that the Jews had caused the plague by poisoning the wells. It was a lie born of ignorance and hate, but in a world gripped by terror, it was a comforting one. It gave the horror a human face. It turned a natural disaster into a conspiracy. The massacres began. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a giant wooden platform in their own cemetery. In Basel, the entire Jewish community was rounded up and incinerated inside wooden buildings. In town after town across Germany and France, the story was the same. The flagellant processions would arrive, whip up the local populace into a frenzy, and lead the pogroms. This was the second great horror. It was the moment humanity, faced with a crisis, turned on itself. The plague was a fire, but it was humanity that provided the fuel of hatred and superstition. It revealed a darkness in the human heart that was far more virulent than any bacterium. Amidst this chaos, a new figure emerged on the streets of Europe, the plague doctor. We know the image, the long, beaked mask, the wide-brimmed hat. But the purpose of the costume was practical. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs and spices, ambergris, mint, cloves, believed to purify the air and protect the doctor from the miasma, the bad air that was thought to carry the disease. Their long coats were waxed to prevent bodily fluids from seeping in. They were the hazmat suits of their day, but these doctors were not scientists. They were something else. They heard the final confessions, saw the final moments of thousands. What did they see? What did they learn? Imagine being one of them, a man named Jean de Bargue, a fictional composite of these figures. He's not a priest, not a soldier. He is a pragmatist. He starts his career believing in miasma and the four humours. He applies the useless cures, but as he moves from one dead city to another, he starts to... It seems to follow trade routes, to cluster in poor, crowded neighbourhoods. He notices it seems to pass from person to person. He is stumbling towards the concept of contagion, an idea that is heresy to the medical establishment of his time. But he sees something else, too. He sees the flagellants and the massacres. He sees the way fear makes people cruel. He sees lords barricading themselves in their castles while their people... And he comes to a chilling conclusion. The pestilence, he writes in a secret journal, is merely a symptom. The true disease is the rot in our own souls. This Black Death is not a punishment from God. It is a mirror, and in it we see our own monstrous reflection. This descent into madness is just the beginning of the story. The plague would return. If you are finding this exploration of history's dark underbelly fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the plague wasn't done with Europe, and the most terrifying truths were yet to be revealed. The Black Death eventually burned itself out, but it left behind a haunted world. As much as a third of Europe's population was gone, the continent was a landscape of ghost towns and fallow fields. The Fedance Macabre Fay, the Dance of Death, appeared in murals and woodcuts across Europe, skeletons leading popes, kings, merchants and peasants in a grim conga line to the grave. The message was clear: death is the great equalizer. No one escapes. For the next 300 years, the plague became a recurring character in the European story. It never again reached the It would flare up in a single city, Milan, Amsterdam, Seville, and wreak havoc before retreating back into the shadows. It became a fact of life, a seasonal terror like hurricanes or wildfires. But the world was changing. The Renaissance had blossomed in the ashes of the Black Death. The printing press was spreading new ideas. Men like Leonardo da Vinci were dissecting the human. Science was beginning to offer a new way of understanding the world, one based on observation and evidence, not superstition and fear. And so, when the plague returned to London in 1665, it found a city in conflict with itself, a city caught between the medieval world of faith and the modern world of science. The Great Plague of London was the last major outbreak in England. It was an echo of the Black Death, but this time the response. When a case was identified, the house was sealed. The sick were quarantined inside with the healthy. A red cross was painted on the door, along with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." A watchman was posted outside to ensure that no one left. It was a death sentence, not just for the infected, but for their entire family. They were left to die together, walled up in their own homes. Imagine the terror. The only contact with the outside world was the grim cry of the cart, "Drivers in the night, bring out your dead." Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, chronicled the city's descent. He wrote of the eerie silence of the once bustling streets, the grass growing between the cobblestones. He wrote of the endless tolling of church bells, a constant funeral dirge He described the desperate search for cures, the quack remedies and talismans sold to the terrified populace. But this plague also saw the rise of a new kind of hero, the parish nurses and the searchers of the dead. These were often poor widowed women who, for a small fee, would go into the sealed houses to tend to the sick, and more importantly, to officially determine the cause of. They were the front-line workers of their day, walking into infected homes, armed with nothing more than a bit of vinegar and a prayer. They were the ones who saw the true face of the plague, up close and personal, and amidst this organized, state-sanctioned horror, something else was stirring. In the taverns and coffee houses where the city's thinkers gathered, and in the hidden lodges of secret societies like the Rosicrucians and early Freemasons, the plague was seen not just as a medical problem, but as a spiritual or alchemical one. Let's imagine a group of these men. They aren't doctors, they are philosophers, alchemists, and mystics. They've read the old texts, they know of Procopius and his demonic, they've studied the chronicles of the Black Death and the rise of the flagellants. They see the plague not as a random occurrence, but as a recurring cycle, a cleansing fire, or perhaps something more malevolent. They believe the plague is an entity, a shadow that falls upon the world when humanity is out of balance. They call it the scourge. They don't seek a vaccine in a laboratory, they gather accounts from the searchers of the dead, not just of symptoms, but of strange occurrences, tales of victims in their final delirium speaking in forgotten languages, of shadows moving in empty rooms, of a palpable sense of cold and dread that has nothing to do with the fever. Their leader, a man we'll call Brother Alistair, proposes a radical theory. "We have been looking at this all wrong," he tells his followers in a hidden cellar. "We think we are fighting a disease of the blood. But what if we are fighting a disease of the soul? What if the buboes and the fever are merely the physical manifestation of a spiritual corruption? The red cross on the door is a symbol. It marks not just a sick house, but a tear in the fabric of the world, a place where the darkness can seep through." They believe the state's response, the quarantines, the mass graves, it is breeding fear, despair, and hatred. And these emotions, they believe, are what the scourge feeds on. They see the cruelty of the sealed houses not as a necessary evil, but as a ritual sacrifice that strengthens their enemy, so they begin their own work. In secret, they try to smuggle food and medicine to the quarantined. They set up their own infirmaries, where they treat the sick not just with herbs, but they are trying to fight the plague by fighting the fear it creates. They are fighting a spiritual battle in the middle of an epidemic. Daniel Defoe, in his Fischer Journal of the Plague Year Fay, which he wrote as if he were an eyewitness, captured this duality perfectly. He described the scientific efforts to understand the plague, but he also filled his book with stories of prophecies, apparitions, and divine judgment. He wrote of a man who ran naked through the streets, crying, "Oh, the great and dreadful God!" a living symbol of the city's tormented soul, the Great Plague of London was a turning point. It was a clash between the dying world of superstition and the emerging world of science. The quarantine measures, though brutal, did seem to help slow the spread. The Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed much of the old crowded city, is often credited with killing off the rats and fleas and ending the plague for good. The official story is that reason won, that bureaucracy and public health measures, however harsh, conquered the disease. But the men in Brother Alistair's secret society would have disagreed. They would have said that the plague simply retreated. They had replaced the fanaticism of the flagellants with the cold, bureaucratic cruelty of the state. The method had changed, but the result was the same: fear, isolation, and death. They collected their journals, their accounts, their strange theories, and they hid them away. They knew the scourge would be back, and they knew that the next time it came, the monster would not be a microbe or a miasma. It would be something. The final act of this long and bloody tragedy takes place not in a sprawling metropolis like London or Constantinople, but in the sun-drenched port of Marseille in 1720. By this time, Europe was firmly in the grip of the Enlightenment. Newton had laid down the laws of motion, Locke had written of human rights, and Voltaire was sharpening his satirical pen. The world of demons and divine wrath. They had quarantine laws now. They had public health boards. They had science. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. The story of the Great Plague of Marseille is not a story of a mysterious, invisible enemy. It is a sordid tale of greed, lies, and catastrophic incompetence. It began with a single ship, the Fay Grand Saint Antoine Fay. It was returning from the Levant. On the voyage, several crew members and the ship's surgeon had died of a mysterious illness. The ship's captain, Jean-Baptiste Chatord, knew exactly what this meant. He knew his ship was infected. He also knew that if he told the truth, his ship and its valuable cargo would be subjected to a strict quarantine, possibly for months, or even burned. The cargo was owned by several powerful merchants in Marseille. The profits were enormous. So Captain Chatord made a choice. He decided to lie. When he arrived in Marseille, he and the ship's owners used their influence to get the quarantine rules bent. They claimed the crew had died of bad food, not plague. They bribed port officials, they pulled strings, they put profit before people. A few token quarantine measures were put in place, but they were slow. A few porters who unloaded the cargo fell sick and died. Then a few of their family members, the doctors who examined them, were puzzled. It looked like plague, but that was impossible, wasn't it? The city authorities, under pressure from the powerful merchants, chose to believe the comforting lies rather than the terrifying truth. They delayed, they dithered, they told the public everything was fine for a few crucial weeks, while the disease spread silently through the city's crowded slums. The people of Marseille went about their business, utterly unaware of the doom that had been unleashed upon them. This is the truth that is more terrifying than the virus. The monster wasn't a bacterium hiding in a bale of cotton. The monster was a ship's captain who valued silk more than human life. It was a group of merchants who saw a public health crisis as a business inconvenience. It was a government that was too weak, too corrupt, and too slow to act. By the time the authorities finally admitted the truth and sealed the city, it was far too late. The plague exploded. The scenes that followed were a ghastly echo of the past mass graves, overflowing hospitals, bodies left in the streets. But this was a man-made disaster. The people knew who to blame. They knew that their suffering was the result of the greed of the city's elite. The social order didn't just collapse. It was pushed. The rage of the poor was palpable. They had been sacrificed for profit. In the midst of the horror, there were heroes, doctors like Jean-Baptiste Bertrand, who stayed to treat the sick and meticulously documented the plague's spread, proving once and for all that it was a contagious disease. There were the